Welcome to this first video of the third module of our MOOC on EU space governance, where we'll discuss the legal aspects of EU space governance. For most of its history, the EU did not have a specific legal basis for acting in the field of space. This was not always a problem because, as we saw, the EU and its predecessor were not always active in space. But it soon became apparent that space was a tool too valuable to be ignored for the implementation of those policy areas where the EU was competent, like trade, research, transport, and the environment. This presented the Union with a problem. Changes to the division of competences between the EU and its member states require changes to the Union's founding treaties. Treaty changes take a long time and require the approval of all member states. And member states are typically wary of granting competences to the EU in areas that are closely intertwined with their national security, like space. So any transfer of competences on space to the EU would present a delicate balancing exercise between the EU and its members. And let's not forget the other actors in space that were already coordinating the activities of European states in space, like ESA. In this video, we will see how the EU went about this exercise. The absence of a specific space competence, first of all, did not stop the EU from taking certain actions in the field of space. But the derivative legal basis for these actions did have two consequences. First of all, if the EU wanted to take an action on matters of space, it had to show that a clear link existed between space and another policy field for which the Union did have a legal basis to act. And secondly, the Union's actions on space would have to be limited in scope to the extent they were linked to this secondary policy field. So without an independent space competence, the Union could not, for example, adopt a full-fledged space policy or start harmonizing the national space legislations of its member states. As a result, the EU's first legislative activities in space were based on a series of different legal bases, and only after the Union exercised significant political pressure to act in this domain. So first, a series of conclusions of the European Council from as early as 1999 stressed the importance of European GNSS programs. These conclusions invited the Council to discuss communications from the European Commission on these programs. Now, when they were finally launched, the EGNOS, Galileo, and GMES, or Copernicus programs, were supported by a legal framework built on two specific legal bases and one general competence. Now, first, the Union relied on its research and technological development, or RTD, competence, which had been conferred to the Union by the Single European Act of 1986. Later, the Union legislator also evoked the Trans-European Networks, or TEN, competences on transport and telecommunications to act in matters of space. These scattered legal bases solved the problem of the lack of an independent space competence, but they also considerably hampered the EU's ability to act as a coordinating and regulating force in the European space landscape. So the need to rethink the approach to the EU's competence on space became even clearer when we look at the third general legal basis that was invoked, which is Article 308 of what was then the Treaty on European Community. This legal basis provides a catch-all competence for the Council to act when this was necessary to attain one of the objectives of the community, but the treaty did not provide the necessary powers. And it was this competence that was used, for example, for the regulation establishing the management structures of the European GNSS programs. So a clearer call to action for introducing a proper space competence for the Union is hard to imagine. And the first real EU space competence was actually provided by the draft treaty establishing a constitution for Europe of 2004. But as you may know, this constitution failed to gather the support of all member states. However, the content of the space provisions in this draft were retained and they were transferred to the Treaty of Lisbon. And this new treaty did, of course, successfully enter into force on the 1st of December of 2009. So what does this Lisbon Treaty have to say about space? First of all, Article 4, Paragraph 3 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, or TFEU, introduces for the first time space as a shared competence between the EU and its member states. This is a huge shift because it allows the EU to finally adopt policy and legal instruments on space without having to link it with other areas of its competence or with specific programs. However, this competence on space remains limited in important ways. First, Article 4, Paragraph 3 adds that the space competence is given to the EU in particular to define and implement programs. So even though the competence can go beyond space programs, it is clear that this should still be the Union's focus in space. Secondly, the treaty says that the exercise of the space competence by the EU does not mean that member states are prevented from exercising their own space competences. And this means that space, in effect, is a parallel competence of the Union and the member states. It means member states can still adopt their own space policy, their own space laws, even in those areas where the EU has already adopted its own rules. Article 189 of the TFEU further clarifies the exercise of the new space competence by the European Union. So, according to this provision, the EU will draw up a European space policy to promote scientific and technical progress, industrial competitiveness, and the implementation of its policies. This is an important reminder that even though space is now its own legal basis, the EU should still approach it mainly as a tool to realize its objectives in other policy areas. This article also clarifies how the EU should go about using space for realizing its policies by promoting joint initiatives, by supporting research and development, and by coordinating the efforts needed for the exploration and exploitation of space. And finally, the Council and the Parliament are encouraged to adopt all necessary measures to reach their policy goals in space. This may include establishing a European Space Programme, which, as we know, is exactly what the EU did. All of this still leaves the European Union with quite a lot of room to maneuver, but the focus is still on specific European initiatives in space and not on elaborating a comprehensive European space law framework. And this is confirmed by Article 189 as well. It stresses that the space competence of the EU does not include the power to harmonize the national space laws of the Union member states. But this did not stop the Commission from developing an EU space law that, among other things, aims to approximate the laws of its member states in terms of safeguards for ensuring the safety, sustainability, and security of space activities in the European Union. It remains to be seen what the member states will make of this initiative. Now, finally, there's another actor in European space governance that might be a bit uneasy with the EU's newfound activity in space, and with the way in which it exercises its dedicated space competence, and that is the European Space Agency. Now, for this relationship, the third paragraph of Article 189 mandates the EU to establish any appropriate relations between the EU and the European Space Agency. What these appropriate relations between these two organizations are, and for that matter, how the EU Space Programme actually gives effect to the Union's space competence of Article 189, will be the subject of our next two videos.